All right, let's dive in. Today, we are breaking down one of the boldest, most audacious geopolitical moves of our time, an event that completely redrew the map of power in the Americas. So picture this. It's January 3rd, 2026. U.S. Special Forces descend on Caracas, Venezuela, and they grab President Nicolás Maduro. Now, this wasn't some kind of messy coup. This was a clean, surgical extraction of a head of state from his own capital. Unthinkable. And that leads us to the billion-dollar question we're tackling today. How? How did the United States manage to do this without a single vote in Congress for a declaration of war? Well, the answer is a fascinating mix of a secret war at sea, some brilliant legal maneuvering, and a radical new vision for American foreign policy. To really get what happened in Caracas, we first have to rewind the clock a few months. We need to look out to the Caribbean Sea, because that's where a totally different kind of war was already heating up. It was called Operation Southern Spear. Now, publicly, this was just a huge anti-drug operation. That's the story they told the world. But behind the scenes, it was what military planners call a shaping operation. The real mission, two things. First, cut off the drug money that was keeping the Maduro regime afloat, and second, poke and prod the Venezuelan military to see exactly how they'd react, basically mapping out their defenses. And you can see on this timeline just how deliberately they ramped things up. It starts in September with lethal force against drug boats. By October, they're calling it an armed conflict, but, and this is key, only against the drug groups, not Venezuela itself. Then they take the fight underwater, sinking a narco sub. But the real line in the sand is December 26th. A CIA drone hits a target on the Venezuelan mainland. That changed everything. That was the U.S. signaling it could and would cross into their territory.
And this table just gives you a little taste of the intensity. We're talking over 35 lethal strikes in just a few months. But zoom in on that last one. That drone strike on a dock? That was the final move in this deadly chess game. It proved the U.S. had the ability and, more importantly, the will to strike inside Venezuela's borders. And that set the stage for everything that came next.
Okay, so military force is one piece of the puzzle, but how did they justify all this legally? Well, that brings us to the second front of this campaign, the war fought in courtrooms and legal offices. This is where a controversial strategy called lawfare, basically using the law as a weapon, comes into play in a really clever way. The absolute key to the whole thing was this concept, narco-terrorism. U.S. lawyers made a bold argument. They said, we're not dealing with the state of Venezuela, we're dealing with a criminal organization that's involved in terrorism. And by doing that, they could argue that guys like Maduro weren't protected by sovereign immunity anymore. You know, that's the international rule that says you can't just prosecute another country's leader. Well, in the eyes of the U.S., Maduro wasn't a president. He was a criminal target. And here's exactly how they did it, a four-step playbook. First, they officially labeled the Cartel of the Suns, a group tied to the regime, as a foreign terrorist organization. Step 2, they indict Maduro himself as the head of that organization. Step 3, they dust off the old post-9/11 authorization for use of military force, arguing it applies here. And then the final step, they reclassify Venezuelan officials as unlawful combatants. Just like that, they had a legal justification to go after them militarily, no declaration of war needed.
So we've got the secret war and we've got the legal war. That covers the how they did it. But what about the why? This is where we see a massive, fundamental shift in American strategy for the entire hemisphere.
And it's called the Donroe Doctrine. Now you can think of this as the old Monroe Doctrine on steroids for the 21st century. But there's a huge difference. The old doctrine was about keeping other big powers out of the Americas. This new one, it's about asserting direct U.S. control over the energy resources in the Americas. It's a blunt, simple message. This hemisphere's oil and gas are a strategic asset of the United States, period. And if you want to know the thinking behind it, you don't have to read some complicated policy paper. Just listen to this quote from the president. It's not about spreading democracy, it's not about human rights, it is purely transactional. We're going to run it, we're going to fix up the oil. It doesn't get much clearer than that. This is a foreign policy built on resources.
And here's how they put that doctrine into practice. The U.S. Navy basically set up a blockade, an oil quarantine. They started seizing tankers, especially from this so-called dark fleet that was moving Venezuelan oil. Then, they just rerouted all that crude to the United States. And with a clever stroke of a pen, an executive order, they made sure that all the money from that oil was protected from anyone else who might have a claim to it and put it under the direct control of the White House. They didn't just capture a president, they captured an entire country's revenue stream.
So Maduro is out and the oil is flowing to the U.S. Now, let's look at what happened next.
the new reality on the ground in Venezuela, and the shockwaves this whole thing sent around the world.
56. What is this number? Well, that's the high-end estimate of how many Cuban military and intelligence officers were killed in the raid that captured Maduro. That single number tells you everything you need to know about how deeply Cuba's security forces were embedded with the regime. They weren't just allies, they were its protectors. In this slide lays out the really stark choice the U.S. made for Venezuela's future. On one side, you've got María Corina Machado, a Nobel Prize winner, hugely popular, a real democratic figure. She was completely pushed aside. Who did the U.S. back instead? Delcy Rodríguez, a longtime insider from the old regime. Why? Because Rodríguez promised one thing: stability and a steady flow of oil. Machado represented a true democratic change, which U.S. planners worried would be too messy. It was pragmatism winning out over ideals, plain and simple.
And the fallout from this went global, fast. China is now staring down the barrel of losing billions in loans that were backed by oil it will never see. Russia's military reputation took a huge hit because its supposedly advanced air defense systems in Venezuela were completely useless. Brazil loudly condemned the whole thing, terrified that it could set a precedent. And neighboring Colombia, they saw which way the wind was blowing and quickly got in line with Washington to save their own skin.
So when you piece it all together, the takeaway is unavoidable. After years, maybe even decades of focusing on other parts of the world, the U.S. is back in its own neighborhood, and it has made it crystal clear that it is the undisputed power here and it's willing to act alone to protect its interests. And all of this leaves us with one final, pretty chilling question. The Donroe Doctrine has set a new precedent. A country's sovereignty is no longer absolute. It's now conditional on whether it aligns with U.S. strategic interests. So if this can happen in Venezuela, you have to wonder, who's next?